The purpose of this video is to highlight certain areas of officiating that we have been focusing on with referees and to serve as a reminder concerning the administration of other rules. Areas we have been focusing on with referees are traveling post and perimeter, perimeter contact, illegal contact in transition and in the half court, defensive responsibility on jump shots, fouls in the act of shooting, rip-throughs, lungeaways, and take fouls, and post contact. The post player on this first play establishes his right foot as his pivot foot after receiving the entry pass. At first, he legally pivots using the ball of his foot, but following that legal move, he then illegally pivots back and forth from heel to toe, thus sliding his pivot foot. This moving of the pivot foot is a violation. This next play is an example of a traveling violation resulting from a player moving his pivot foot at the end of a dribble. The offensive post player gathers the ball while his left foot is on the floor and legally establishes a pivot foot with his right foot on his first step. After the player legally takes his second step with his left foot, he steps with his right pivot foot while still holding the ball, thus committing a traveling violation. This play is an example of a traveling violation occurring at the start of a dribble. To legally start a dribble, a player must release his dribble prior to lifting his pivot foot from the floor. On this play, the offensive player with the ball established his right foot as his pivot foot, and he then drop steps with his right pivot foot prior to releasing the ball. This type of movement is illegal and is correctly ruled a traveling violation. Here is an example of a hop travel during a spin move. A player may not touch the floor consecutively with the same foot after gathering the ball. Here the dribbler gathers the ball and hops from his right foot to right foot as he spins between two opponents. Once again, it is illegal for a player to touch the floor consecutively with the same foot after gathering the ball, and traveling was the correct ruling on this play. This is another example of a traveling violation for a hop step. An offensive player with the ball may not hop consecutively on the same foot upon ending his dribble. The offensive player on this play gathers the ball and ends his dribble with his right foot as he enters the paint. He then jumps and lands with that same right foot, committing a traveling violation. The first play in this series is an example of illegal contact by a defender on a dribbler. On-ball defenders cannot affect an opponent's speed, quickness, balance, or rhythm. On this play, the hedging defender places a hand on the dribbler as he advances, and he affects the dribbler's forward movement. Thus, this is a defensive foul for hand checking. This next play is an example of a defender using an illegal forearm above the free throw line extended. A defender may not have an extended forearm in contact with an opponent with the ball above the free throw line extended. On this play, the defender places his extended forearm onto the back of the dribbler. This contact at this point on the floor is an automatic foul, regardless if the contact disrupts the offensive player's speed, quickness, balance, or rhythm. This is an example of a defensive foul for an illegal forearm below the free throw line extended. Below the free throw line extended and outside the lower defensive box, a defender may not use an extended forearm to the front side of an offensive player with the ball. On this play, however, the defender does make contact with his forearm on the front of the driving offensive player. This contact is an automatic foul, whether or not it disrupts the offensive player's speed, quickness, balance, or rhythm. This first play in this series is an example of a defensive foul for impeding progress in transition. The highlighted defensive player on this play reaches out and grabs the arm of the offensive player in transition, impeding his progress and affecting his freedom of movement. This is a defensive foul. This play is another example of a defensive foul for impeding progress in transition. The highlighted defensive player here wraps his arm around the transitioning offensive player, impeding his progress and affecting his freedom of movement. Again, this is a defensive foul. This next play is an example of an offensive foul for dislodging a defensive player who is in a legal guarding position. On this transition play, the offensive player runs right into the legally positioned defender, dislodging him from his legally obtained position. This is an offensive foul on the player in the white uniform. This is an example of an uncommon offensive foul in transition. The defensive player in transition here is legally moving alongside the path of the offensive player with the ball. The offensive player then turns into that legal defender, initiating illegal contact. This is an offensive foul on the dribbler for initiating the illegal contact. This next play is an example of a defensive foul for impeding progress in the half court. The highlighted defensive player here crashes into his opponent as the offensive player moves and cuts into the lane. This illegal contact is correctly ruled to be a defensive foul for impeding progress. This final play in this series is an example of a defender dislodging an offensive player who is in a legal screening position. The offensive player here positions himself legally in the path of the moving defensive player, allowing him the opportunity to stop and or change direction. However, the defensive player moves into and through the legally positioned screener, dislodging him from his legal position. This is a defensive foul on number 5 in the dark uniform. This first play in this series is an example of a defensive foul for undercutting an airborne shooter. Defenders may not move into the landing area of an airborne shooter. Whether intentional or not, this is a dangerous play and it will be penalized. Airborne shooters must be allowed the opportunity to return to the floor safely. Another example of a player undercutting an airborne shooter can be seen on this next play. The defender here extends his right foot forward, and the shooter then lands on top of that defender's foot. Again, this is a dangerous play, and it will be penalized with a defensive foul call. This is an example of an offensive foul for overtly changing direction into an opponent. On this play, the offensive player jumps back into his right, and he illegally contacts an opponent who has established a legal position to his side. Since the contact was initiated by the offensive player, and it is more than marginal contact, an offensive foul is the correct ruling. This final play in this series is an example of a defensive foul for making illegal contact with an airborne shooter. On this play, the defender extends his right hand and makes contact to the stomach area of the shooter. This is a defensive foul on number 8 in the green uniform. This first group of plays reflects a competition committee rule clarification regarding an offensive player attempting to draw continuation during a rip-through by initiating contact with a defender. If a defensive player has his arm or arms extended and contact is made with an offensive player with the ball during his rip-through from side to side, a foul shall be assessed, but the player is not considered in the act of shooting. If the contact is after the side-to-side movement and during an upward shooting motion towards the basket, continuation will be awarded. If the defensive player is outside the lower defensive box and his arm or arms are extended, and an offensive player with the ball initiates contact by extending or lunging his arm or arms away from the basket into the extended arm or arms of the defender, a non-shooting foul shall be assessed. On this first play, as the offensive player rips through with the ball, he initially makes contact with the defensive player's extended arm during his side-to-side motion, but prior to his upward shooting motion. Unless there is a penalty situation, no free throws will be awarded on a play like this, since the offensive player was not yet in the act of shooting. To avoid being assessed a non-shooting foul, the defender must pull his arm back to avoid contact or position it vertically overhead. Here again, the initial contact occurs during the offensive player's rip-through move with the defensive player's extended arm before the offensive player's upward shooting motion. The replay clearly shows the initial contact occurring during the side-to-side movement and before the upward motion. Again, to avoid being assessed a non-shooting foul, the defender must pull his arm back to avoid contact or position it vertically overhead. Once again, we will see the initial contact occur with the defensive player's extended arm during a rip-through move, but before the offensive player's upward shooting motion. We can see that the initial contact occurs during the side-to-side movement, and therefore this would not be ruled continuation. Here again, the offensive player initially makes contact with the defensive player's extended right arm while he is still in his side-to-side movement, and prior to the start of his upward shooting motion. This is a non-shooting foul, and free throws would only be awarded if the penalty is in effect. On this next play, the offensive player attempts to draw contact during his upward motion by lunging away from the basket and coming up and under the defender's arm. While this is a defensive foul because the defender didn't have his arms vertical and he didn't withdraw them to avoid contact, it occurs outside of the lower defensive box, and the offensive player is clearly lunging away from the basket. Because of those factors, this is not deemed a field goal attempt. Similar to the previous play, the offensive player here is outside the lower defensive box, and he lunges away from the basket to draw contact, coming up and under the defender's extended arm, which is clearly off to his side. This is a defensive foul, but it is a non-shooting foul, and free throws will only be awarded if the penalty is in effect. The next two plays show another competition committee clarification dealing with continuation on take fouls. When there is no penalty situation in effect, if a defender takes a foul against an offensive player with the ball to stop play, no continuation will be awarded unless the offensive player has already started an upward shooting motion towards the basket, or it is imminent that the game or shot clock will expire, or he is driving to the basket. On this play here, the defensive player takes the foul in the backcourt, and the offensive player then starts his upward motion to shoot. Again, no free throws shall be awarded on this play unless the penalty is in effect. Similar to the previous play, the defender here takes a foul in the backcourt, and after the initial contact, the offensive player then starts his upward motion. This is clearly a defensive foul, but again, no free throws would be awarded in this situation unless the penalty is in effect. This first play in this series is an example of an offensive foul in the post. The highlighted offensive player here uses an illegally extended right arm in an effort to create space to receive an entry pass. Offensive players may not hold off or dislodge their opponents with an extended arm. This is an offensive foul on the player in the white uniform. This is an example of an illegal arm wrap in the post area. The defensive post player here starts in a legal guarding position, but he then wraps his arm around his opponent's hip. Arm wraps are illegal regardless of where they occur on the court. This is a defensive foul on number 4 in the dark uniform. This final play in the post-contact series is an example of a defensive foul for two-hand contact by a post defender. When guarding an offensive player with the ball in the lower defensive box, a defender may use one hand, one forearm, and/or one leg to maintain his position. On this play, however, the post defender uses two hands, which is illegal, and a defensive foul is called. Note that two hands or two forearms by a defender is an automatic foul. The respect for the game guidelines emphasized last season, which apply to conduct by players on the floor relating to officiating, remain in effect. There have been no changes to their enforcement. The guidelines do not prohibit a player from showing disagreement with calls or asking questions, provided that conversations and actions are not persistent, excessive, or disrespectful. Referees have again been instructed to warn players when they engage in persistent complaining or questioning before assessing a technical foul. After a loose ball foul is called against him on this play, number 2 in the white uniform commits an overtly disrespectful gesture in resentment to the call. These types of overt reactions are technical fouls, whether directed towards an official or not. They violate the respect for the game guidelines and will be penalized with a technical foul. After the foul is called against him at the end of this play, number 6 in the white uniform commits an overtly disrespectful gesture in resentment to the call when he throws the ball high in the air. A technical foul shall be assessed for this type of action, as it violates the respect for the game guidelines. On this final example regarding respect for the game, number 9 in the green uniform violates the respect for the game guidelines when he turns towards an official and gives a wave-off and comments in resentment to the no call. Even though there was a slight delay between the no call and the gesture, it is clear that the player's act was in response to the officiating. This gesture was directed directly at an official and is deemed disrespectful and will be assessed a technical foul. In a pass and crash type play, a defender can draw the offensive foul if he successfully establishes his position in the offensive player's path before the offensive player starts his upward motion to pass. The defender on this play does establish his position before the offensive player starts his upward motion, and he is dislodged from that position as the offensive player continues moving forward and goes through the defender's space. This is an offensive foul. This next play will show an example of a defensive foul for blocking as the defensive player is positioned in the restricted area. To be considered legal and to draw an offensive foul, a secondary defensive player must have both feet established outside the restricted area line. On this play, the secondary defender is clearly positioned within the restricted area arc, and a defensive foul is correctly called. This is an example of an offensive foul for charging, with the defender legally positioned outside the restricted area. On this play, the secondary defender clearly established legal position prior to the offensive player starting his upward shooting motion, and his feet are completely outside the restricted area. Since the defender established his position outside the restricted area, and he did so prior to the start of the upward motion, this is an offensive foul for charging. This is an example of an offensive foul as the offensive player extends his left arm, impeding the defender from defending the shot attempt. An offensive player may naturally use his off arm as long as there is a bend at the elbow, but he may not extend it fully as seen on this play. Again, this is an offensive foul for the illegal ward-off. If an offensive player unnaturally extends any body part into a defender, an offensive foul will be called, as seen on this play with an extended leg by the offensive player. The replays here clearly show the offensive player unnaturally extending his right leg into the defensive player, who is jumping vertically from within the restricted area. Again, this is an offensive foul. The defensive player on this play jumps straight up in an attempt to contest his opponent's field goal attempt. As the contact on the play is initiated by the offensive player and it is marginal, no foul has occurred. Note that even if a secondary defender is positioned inside the restricted area, he does not commit a blocking foul if contact is made while he is jumping vertically in an attempt to defend the shot. Similar to the previous play, the defensive player on this play jumps straight up in an attempt to contest his opponent's field goal attempt. As the contact on the play is initiated by the offensive player and it is marginal, no foul has occurred. Note that even if the secondary defender is positioned inside the restricted area, he does not commit a blocking foul if contact is made while he is jumping vertically in an attempt to defend the shot. This is an example of a defensive foul for non-verticality. To be considered legal, a defender may come in contact with an opponent if the contact is made while the defender is jumping vertically in an attempt to defend the shot. On this play, however, the defender jumps toward the shooter, and since the defender does not maintain a completely vertical position and he initiates the contact on the play, a defensive foul is called. This first play in this series is an example of an offensive foul for an illegal screen set in a pick-and-roll situation. The offensive player here extends his leg and he trips the moving defender. An offensive screener may not extend his legs outside the vertical plane of his body when setting a screen. If contact occurs with that screener's extended leg, as it was on this play, an offensive foul has been committed. Another example of an offensive foul for an illegal screen set in a pick-and-roll situation can be seen here. The offensive player setting the screen clearly steps into the path of the trailing defender without giving him the opportunity to stop and or change direction. Again, this is an offensive foul for an illegal screen. This final example of an offensive foul for an illegal screen, this time set off the ball in the lane. During this cross screen in the lane, the offensive player illegally moves to his left, and he moves into the path of the trailing defender without giving that defender an opportunity to stop and or change direction. This is an offensive foul for an illegal screen. This final play in this series shows another example of an offensive foul for an illegal screen, this time in a dribble handoff situation. Following the pass to his teammate, the offensive player continues to move forward, and in doing so, he moves into the path of the trailing defender, without giving that defender the opportunity to stop and or change direction. This is an offensive foul for an illegal screen. This is an example of a defensive foul in a pick-and-roll situation for blocking. A hedging defender needs to establish himself in the path of the dribbler before contact is made. On this play, the hedging defender does not establish a legal position in the path of the dribbler prior to contact, and this is a defensive foul. This play is an example of a loose ball foul for clamping. During the rebounding action, the highlighted player in the white uniform clamps the left arm of his opponent who is attempting to gain possession of the rebound. This is a loose ball foul on number 2 in the white uniform. Players may not use their arms to lock, clamp, or wrap their opponents, affecting their opponent's freedom of movement. This is another example of a loose ball foul, again occurring during rebounding action. The highlighted player in the white uniform here clamps the left arm of his opponent, who is attempting to gain possession of the rebound. This is a loose ball foul on number 4 in the white uniform. Again, players may not use their arms to lock, clamp, or wrap their opponents, affecting their opponent's freedom of movement. This is an example of a discontinued dribble violation. Dribblers may not have any part of their hand under the ball, bringing their dribble to a pause before continuing on with their dribble. On this play, the offensive player brings part of his hand under the ball, bringing the ball to a pause in an attempt to freeze the defender before continuing his dribble. This is a discontinued dribble violation. This next play is another example of a discontinued dribble violation. Dribblers may not have any part of their hand under the ball, bringing their dribble to a pause before continuing on with their dribble. In this play, as the offensive player moves into the front court, he brings part of his hand under the ball, bringing the ball to a pause in an attempt to freeze the defender before continuing on with his dribble. This is an example of a flagrant foul, penalty 1. On this play, the defensive player makes unnecessary contact after his windup when he makes hard contact to his opponent's head area. Again, a flagrant foul, penalty 1, is contact that is unnecessary, and the penalty for a flagrant 1 is 2 free throws for the offended player, and his team would also retain possession of the ball. This next play is an example of a flagrant foul, penalty 2. A flagrant foul, penalty 2, is defined as contact that is unnecessary and excessive. The defensive player on this play makes contact with a vulnerable airborne opponent in a non-basketball manner with a high potential for injury, and it meets enough of the criteria for a flagrant foul, penalty 2. The penalty for a flagrant 2 is 2 free throws for the offended player, and his team would also retain possession of the ball. The offending player would also be ejected from the game, pending confirmation of the call via instant replay review. As per the competition committee, the 24-second clock will be modified this season to display tenths of a second when less than 5 seconds remains in the countdown. While there are some related technical changes, these changes do not affect play. However, teams should note that the change in display may affect how players use the clock as a reference point. For example, an 8-second backcourt violation is still 8 seconds, but will now occur when the shot clock displays 15 and not 16. The following video showing the countdown of the old and new shot clocks will help clarify why the violation is now at 15 versus 16. The clock on the left is the old clock, and the one on the right is the new clock. Notice how the 24 will be displayed on the old clock for a full second while it immediately changes when the clock starts on the new clock. Also note how the old clock expires after ticking from 1 second, and the new clock expires after ticking from 1/10 of a second, but both expire at the same time. Please review the preseason memo for additional information about this change. A delay of game will be assessed for a team not entering or returning to the game upon the sounding of the second horn signaling the end of a timeout or period break, such that play cannot resume.